Kia ora. I'm John Reid from Water New Zealand, and in this edition of Tāwara Aotearoa, we unpack the findings of the second National Climate Change Risk Assessment. The recently released report has assessed water infrastructure as the highest climate change risk facing us in Aotearoa New Zealand. The report points to gaps in policy readiness and the potential for cascading impacts across communities, economies, and other infrastructure systems.
Science can give us information and knowledge, but it can't really, in these big predicaments that we're dealing with, it can't give us the answers. The answers are related to our values, our place in the world, how we interact with each other, how we think about the natural environment, and how we value that. And these are bigger questions than science can solve.
In this edition, my co-host Hannah Edmond and I are joined by climate change adaptation specialist James Hughes from Tonkin and Taylor as we discuss the challenges ahead and how we as a water sector need to respond. Kia ora, Hannah and James.
Kia ora, John. Kia ora, Hannah. Nice to be here. Good to be talking to you both.
Kia ora. So, James, this is the second climate change risk assessment. How is it different to the first one, and what are the key issues that are brought up in this revision?
Good question. So there are a lot of similarities to the first one and some differences. Probably the first thing to say is the way they've categorized the different themes of risk. This year, they've grouped it into key infrastructure, communities and safety, nature and the bioeconomy, and broad category around decisions and funding. So that was a difference, I guess, in the previous iteration where it was focused around the domains of built environment, natural environment, social, economic governance. So they've reframed things. I would say broadly the detail sitting within those is quite similar, but those categories are different. The second key difference is probably the methodology that was used. So the first time I was involved in the first one, and kind of as part of the consulting team. This time I was a minor reviewer of the built environment piece. Was the risk? So the other difference was the risk assessment methodology. This year they've added some factors around the risk severity, which was the first part of the assessment. Then there was a new part called policy readiness, which was, I guess, an assessment of each risk in relation to the policy environment, how apt and ready the policy environment is to respond. And there was a third piece around the cascading risks. For each individual risk, what were the level of the cascading implications of that? So there's a lot to probably dig into, which we may not get into today, but each of those parts has its own challenges when you're doing these risk assessments at a national level. So, there are a lot of methodological challenges which people have been diving into.
So I guess for our listeners who particularly have a focus on the water sector, what does it tell us about the water infrastructure and the water industry?
Interestingly, the top risk identified of all the domains was the risks to water infrastructure. The first one was water infrastructure. The second was effective adaptation implementation. The third was Te Tiriti o Waitangi. So the built environment, features at the very top, and it doesn't re-emerge until sort of far later down the list in waste management. So within that water infrastructure one, it was rated currently a major risk that went to their rating of extreme risk by 2050, and then maintained that level out towards the end of century. And the policy readiness scores were generally significant gaps or insufficient, generally across the board. That was their rating of that. And the cascading risk score, i.e. the potential for water infrastructure to impact on other risks, was rated as high, of a scale between low to very high. So it was near the top end. So those are the reasons why it's scored high. What's included within water infrastructure is obviously the three waters: water supply, wastewater, and stormwater as well. And there are some statistics in there to provide sort of insight into the level of exposure and risk, which I've got, which we can talk about as well. But that's the broad overview of why it was the most significant one.
And we really do sit at the centre of all of this, don't we, in the water sector? Like that's a real clear message that that's really where we are. There's such an impact on us and also from us and the work that we're doing.
Yeah, you did right. I mean, obviously, water is foundational to all our societies and economies. It's interesting to think about the cascades from a, I guess, purely infrastructure perspective. I think when you're thinking about interdependencies within systems, there are probably other infrastructure systems that sit, however you want to describe it, below water that support it, right? Of course, power and access to water facilities and assets, if they are impacted, then that causes our water supply systems to fail. So I think in terms of the hierarchy of importance in a purely lifelines infrastructure perspective, water infrastructure is has a lot of importance, but there are actually other factors that I'm surprised didn't probably get featured so much, like access and transport, and that was a key risk as well, but for other reasons I wasn't scored as high.
James, were there any sort of real differences between the assessments between sort of water, wastewater and stormwater and the flood risk, or was there anything in the assessment sort of to call out particularly areas or topics of interest there?
Yeah, I think the main, and this probably won't be a surprise to anyone, but the main topics from a water supply perspective were drought and the potential for more extreme droughts going forward, and our ability to respond to those in line with water demand increasing in different parts of the country. The second, in a wastewater context, and again, this won't be a surprise, but I recall this came out in both the first one and the second one, is aging infrastructure, inflow and infiltration into systems, more extreme events causing overflows into our receiving environments that are already under stress, whether that be land-based rivers or coastal environments. There are some interesting risks to wastewater networks that probably haven't been experienced in New Zealand to date, but are being experienced internationally. For example, where you get extreme droughts and water restrictions put in place, and you might get significant reductions in flows within wastewater networks that can cause blockages in very low gradient systems. So that has happened, I think, in California, where they've had a lot of water restrictions in low gradient systems. They've had a huge spike in maintenance requirements because the systems just block up, and even trees busting through pipes looking for water in extreme droughts. So those types of things I don't think we've necessarily experienced here, but possibly on the radar going forward for certain systems in certain locations. Yeah. And on the stormwater side, sorry, just to finish off, again, no surprise to anyone, but our stormwater systems, and it's tricky to kind of couch stormwater networks in the context of climate risk, because they are there to manage the impacts of the flooding, right? And so to say the stormwater networks are at risk, they're kind of there for a reason. So it's really more of a framing, I think, of, in the first instance, the capacity of those stormwater networks to manage flood events. There's also the direct impacts, obviously, of scour erosion at the coast or within, river environments, of the direct damage to those networks. But more importantly, I think it's the capacity of those systems, and are they being designed adequately going forward? What climate scenarios should we be using to design for exceedance or design for, routine design events? So those are interesting questions that are pretty live at the moment.
So that sort of sets the scene really nicely. Thanks, James. But what do we need to change going forwards? We're at a point where we're actually doing a lot of planning, a lot of change in the water industry now. What from this should we be looking at in the future to try and change the way we do things?
Well, let's start with a big picture comment, I think, around how our urban environments are really under strain in terms of infrastructure provision in general and across the three waters. I think the reason for that is that we have taken a low density urban development model for most of our urban centres. And if you think about Tauranga, where I live, Hamilton, Auckland, obviously, Rotorua, we've got these growing centres that I think we're just going to be sort of in this continual cycle of not being able to keep up with the maintenance and renewals of those systems. So we're in a situation where I think the development typology that we have adopted over the last 100 years has led to this situation where we actually don't have a lot of money to go around. And that means when we get climate impacts or different conditions which we're building these infrastructure systems in, we're really coming up against sort of limits in terms of funding and financing and the ability to design well. So then you kind of overlay that as the big picture, and then how do we do things better? And within those systems, I think it is taking a different approach to how we build cities in general. That's probably point one, and how we sort of think about the development impacts of that. Specifically for stormwater, I think we've got to do a much better job at designing overland flow paths, keeping buildings well, appropriate levels of freeboard, all that stuff that people probably are well aware of. But, to a certain degree, we're still seeing developments that are being allowed to be permitted in zones that you would probably say shouldn't be developed in from a flood perspective. The big challenge, though, is how do you deal with existing communities who are flooding, or the stormwater systems are undersized, causing flooding in those areas. And that is the adaptation challenge, whether it's in floodplains or at the coast. Moving to the other waters, I think the reforms that we're seeing, time will tell, but in theory that will create more equipped, larger organisations that will have the capability and capacity to, deliver better targeted water and wastewater and stormwater services across our community. So I would hope that our responses to drought and the other impacts for water supply, water quality and quantity will be addressed through those reforms. We just need to balance, I guess, the demand and the increasing demand through population growth with our ability to supply those. And the last thing I'll say is, the advent of, or the proliferation, if you like, of large water consumers, commercial or industrial ones, i.e. these big data centers that might emerge or are emerging, and how we manage competing demands for large water users over time.
So I guess there's lots in there about what we're thinking of going forwards and things we should be contemplating and putting into water service strategies and things. But in terms of practical things people can be putting in place from this kind of high level guidance that we've got in the risk assessment, what should people be focusing on, and what kind of next steps should we be really taking when we're looking at this?
I think there's a few angles to that. The first thing I'll say is probably that this national level assessment, I want to choose my words carefully, it is very useful to give an overview of the national picture, but that kind of starts and finishes at that level. And I'd also say that it's very difficult to do a risk assessment at the national level inherently, because you are in a world of averages, right? So you're saying, what is the risk to water supply networks across New Zealand? Well, it's been rated high. Well, it depends. Is that, if you start, is that high across the country? Is it high in Auckland? And so obviously most people would, I think, implicitly have questions about, how you would use that information. I think what it does tell us is that, yes, there are pretty common and consistent risks across most areas, and it gives you that direction. But to your point, we need to be able to sort of cascade that down to the local level, and local councils or water authorities then need to understand the risks specifically to their infrastructure and their communities for those services. So that's probably point one. I've probably done, over 50 climate risk assessments and counting at different scales. And the common issues from an infrastructure perspective, I think, that arise are kind of framing the risk assessment in the right way to deliver the decision insights that you're seeking. And I think people don't ask that question clearly at the start. What decisions are we trying to inform through this risk assessment? And let's design a process that will help us inform that. And I think that relates to the scale you're looking at, and also the data sources that you're using. So if you're looking at, for example, flood impacts on above ground infrastructure, then make sure the flood information obviously that you've got and you've got access to is up to date. It uses the right climate factors and is suitable for that purpose. If you're doing a flood risk assessment to guide adaptation planning for communities living in a floodplain, then you want to be pretty much more, I suppose, rigorous around the information that you're using and then sharing with communities, because the magnifying glass will come out on day one going, where's my property in relation to that floodplain? And you want to be able to, justify and defend that information. So again, I think there's been, a lot of lessons that we should be able to foresee going forward. If you're doing this, then make sure you've got the right information, or that you've designed the process in the right way. And I could go on, but I think that's one point. More specifically, I think design parameters are going to become, they already are, a topic of discussion, particularly around how we're including climate factors for our design of water, wastewater and stormwater systems. The kind of scenario debate that's ongoing, should we be using a very high warming scenario, SSP 8.5, versus a more current policy scenario, which might be somewhere in the middle around SSP 4.5, or should we be using the sort of middle ground of the 3.7?
I mean, it's lots of moving parts, isn't it? For those who aren't aware, SSP?
So SSP stands for Shared Socioeconomic Pathways, and the IPCC in their 6th assessment report generated 5 representative emission scenarios called SSPs, and that's code for the Shared Socioeconomic Pathways. They're based on socioeconomic futures that are, I guess, plausible futures in terms of how society and behaviour will unfold. And alongside that, there are various emissions reduction technologies applied to those to get a baseline socioeconomic outcome, and then the emissions reduction that goes with that. So across those 5 scenarios, you've got a really high warming one, which is basically 4 to 5 degrees by end of century. That's the 8.5 one, 8.5. And at the bottom end, you've got a couple of scenarios that they're called 1.9 and 2.6. And those are both scenarios where we massively reduce emissions to keep warming with below 1.5 or 2 degrees. So you've got 2 at the bottom end, 1 really high one, and a couple in the middle. And so when you're thinking about climate risk, your first question is, under what scenario? And are we taking a really precautionary approach and using, the super high one, or something in between? Or are we assuming that we are going to be successful in reducing our emissions and actually have, limit the impacts of a warming world? The National Climate Risk Assessment used a high warming scenario, SSP 3.7, as there, so not the extreme high one, as well as a mid-range one, and they sort of based it around global warming levels. So that was a global warming level of, at the high end, around 3 to 3.5 degrees by end of century.
So it's fascinating, James. What do we do to make some of those things stick, really? How do people actually start implementing some of these things, so we are starting to change how we deliver?
There are real challenges, I think, in the sort of societal challenges around climate and adaptation. If you're bringing that in a little bit narrower to infrastructure and infrastructure provision, then these things are all, I think, able to be engineered and managed if we think about good design practice and leveraging the data sources that we've got and the technologies and smarts that our engineering community have. So from an engineering perspective, this is able to be adapted and managed within. However, that sits within a broader context of being able to, I guess, come up with or manage this challenge where we decide how do we deal and support those communities that are at risk or might be facing existential risk. So you've got I think that's the big question for me, is you've got the infrastructure provision, but that sits within the broader system that I think has some massive challenges. So if you're saying we've got a community in the coast or in a floodplain that might be facing existential problems around remaining in place, how do we either protect or avoid or even think about managed retreat, and who pays for that? How do we deal with the equity issues? So I think that is the overlay that is still unknown and will continue to be very fraught and debated. So if we were just talking about building infrastructure and dealing with that in isolation, we go, yeah, we can do that. But I think this is the big problem, right? We don't have a mechanism. Basically, if you want to go to both ends of that spectrum, we're saying, do we leave it to the market for people to basically fend for themselves, option A, or somewhere across the other spectrum and go, no, the government and councils should support everyone and provide compensation. I think those are the two extreme ends of that debate, and where we land in between will probably be, you've seen current government come out on, I think, try to be quite clear that they prefer lesser degree of buyouts, or basically tapering off government support for buyouts from extreme events. And I think Auckland Council has said something similar. So we're seeing some signals there. So I think that is the big problem. As an engineering community coming to your sort of point from the water sector, how do we make this sort of stick and enduring? I think we've got to probably be as active as possible in supporting those discussions from both a science and engineering perspective, which is difficult in its own right. I saw some maps the other day. I mean, this is a slight tangent, but this will interest people. I was talking to a climate scientist, and I was asking the question around the HERDS data and the extreme rainfall in New Zealand. And my question to him was, am I right in saying that extreme levels of rainfall, i.e. 100-year events and these extreme floods, extreme rainfall events that we're seeing, could occur anywhere in New Zealand, right? And so, are there areas of New Zealand, when you look at the maps, that are less likely to experience extreme events? Or is the nature of our ability to predict extreme rainfall not really able to provide a single source of truth around where extreme rainfall could get warm? And so he pulled up 5 maps of New Zealand at a high level. One was the previous climate projections under CMIP 5, so that was the previous one. Then he pulled up another one which was showing a shaded map of extreme rainfall in New Zealand under current CMIP 6. Then he had another study which I can't recall. He did some work using machine learning, was the 4th one, and I think there was a 5th one. 5 maps of New Zealand, all shaded with where the extreme rainfall could occur into more or less degree. They were all different. And I just went, wow, people don't understand that. People don't understand. Well, I mean, I think this needs to be discussed and sort of dived into, not now, but with the experts, is saying, is the information, say the HERDS data, which is the high intensity rainfall something system that NIWA, that we all rely on to get our rainfall information from for the extreme events, that's from CMIP 5. I think they're currently developing the CMIP 6 version. But yeah, we've just got to ask ourselves, do we actually know enough about this? And and what are the gaps in our scientific understanding? It doesn't mean we do nothing, but I think we've got to just continually question and better understand the science. The last thing I'll say is, when I asked him a bit more about that, he said, well, in very simple terms, we know quite a lot about temperature and the effect of emissions on global temperatures and local temperatures and regional temperatures. But then taking that temperature impact, as you can imagine, in terms of how that impacts on rainfall, that's a whole bunch of other assumptions in climate models in terms of how temperature increases the ability of the atmosphere to hold water and causes more extreme rainfall. And there's a whole bunch of uncertainties in that modeling. And so as you get more and more complex, in terms of the emissions, temperature, rainfall, etc., there's uncertainty introduced into those systems, and the models often say different things. So that was a little bit of a digression, but I think we need to, as an engineering community, continually strive to better understand the science, and that's tricky because we often just take a design parameter from herds and use it without necessarily understanding that what the genesis of that is and what the uncertainties attached.
I mean, it's covering a really important part of all of this, isn't it? That what we're doing is we're predicting into the future what's going to happen and how it's going to happen. And that's really important to do so that we can try and design, but understanding where those predictions come from and the reliability around those predictions and how things can change is quite fundamental to it all. I've really enjoyed all of that learning. Thank you, James. It's really good to hear it kind of pulled together in a way that we can actually start to think about how we can apply it across the sector, whether we're working for clients and consultants and contractors and all sorts. If you could wrap it up into some like 2 key takeaways that you think people should be taking away from all of this, what do you think they would be?
I think the first one is doing our best to kind of just drawing on that point, Hannah, about the science and getting enough input when we're doing risk assessments to, without becoming a climate scientist, but making sure that we know enough about the genesis of the information that we're using. And when we're doing risk assessments or designing infrastructure, that we're using data sources and quality of data that's commensurate with the decision that we're trying to make. So if it's a high level assessment of risk to infrastructure or whatever, then, fine, that's cool. But if you're actually coming to the point of, well, this is a risk assessment that might impact on people's ability to live in place, then that requires a different level of rigor and really justifying what scenarios we're choosing and the basis for that. So that's probably point one. The other one which I'll throw in, which I've just been listening to an audiobook by a guy called Dougal Hine, who, if anyone wants to really question where we're heading and humanity's purpose and role in our predicament, if you like, and that's just not climate, but it's more broadly. He talks really interestingly about the role of science and the limitations of science, which I find interesting. And I think his point is science can give us information and knowledge, but it can't really, in these big predicaments that we're dealing with, it can't give us the answers. The answers are related to our values, our place in the world, how we interact with each other, how we think about the natural environment and how we value that. And these are bigger questions than science can solve. And I think his point is that we are often using mantras like just follow the science. And I really like that. And it's controversial, but it's like, I think, what do we value? How do we prioritize what we value? And how do we actually take steps to change our behavior? And the science gives us some information and insight into what those issues are, but it's not going to give us the solutions necessarily.
Thank you, James, for joining Hannah and myself today. It was really great to talk to you about adaptation and some of those sort of outcomes. Really fascinating. Thank you. And thank you for listening to this latest episode. We'll be back soon with another one.